Do you remember the generation gap that existed between your parents when you were a teenager? And now most of you are parents yourselves. Do you sense the same kind of generation gap widening between you and your children? I'm asking you to remember when you were young, the generation gap between you and your parents. And also now, when you are adults, the generation gap between you and your children. This morning, when we consider the story of Joshua calling upon Israel to serve the Lord, in order to understand that story, we have to factor in the reality of a generation gap. Generation gap will serve important functions in that particular passage. We have to acknowledge that Joshua and his audience, when Joshua was in Shechem addressing, the entire congregation of the Israelite people, we need to remember and remind ourselves of the reality that Joshua and his audience has a generation gap. Because Joshua belongs to the so-called Exodus generation. Exodus generation means those people who crossed the Red Sea, who left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and entered bravely into the unknown, into the desert, and traveled there for almost 40 years until finally some of them, actually only 2 of them, got to enter into the promised land. The entire generation of Exodus actually passed away, didn't make it to the promised land. But Joshua belongs to that generation. But now his audience, the people who gather at Shechem, listening to Joshua saying to them, they belong to the second generation, what I call the promised land generation. Of course, they heard about the past history, but because they do not have firsthand experience of what Exodus was like, what God was like, leading them all the way through now in the promised land. So this lack of firsthand experience, Joshua was afraid, could be a hindrance, on the issue when they are trying to make an important decision about their relationship with God. So that is the reason why Joshua summoned and gathered all the Israelite people at Shechem and asked them to promise him that they will serve exclusively the Lord who led their forefathers out of Egypt. Well, that is not easy because, in the lack of firsthand experience, there is a generation gap. So when Joshua called God's people to meet him at Shechem, he intended for them to make a choice. That choice could compensate for the lack of firsthand experience with God. Joshua wanted them to maintain a sustaining relationship with God. That if they made a wise choice, the most important, the most critical, relationship, the relationship between God and Israelite people can be maintained. If they made a poor choice, all the other relationships in their lives will be jeopardized. This is what Joshua told them. Let me repeat that phrase for you. Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the Lord or the God your ancestors served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. Joshua apparently offered choices, options. You can choose to serve, the deities when your ancestors, starting from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, starting from those legendary ancestors, before they even enter into this promised land, long ago, maybe 400 years ago. Our ancestors came from, beyond the river. It's today's Euphrates and Tigris, the cradle of civilization. If you know that story, you can choose to serve the Lord there, or you can choose to serve the deities, worshipped by the local people. Now we are in this promised land, but there are other people living here, and they serve all kinds of God. You can choose to worship either your ancestors before they enter this promised land, or the local people, local people's deities. Take your choice. But Joshua also says, as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua also declared his own choice. I give you, 3 options: ancient deities, local deities, or the one who led your forefathers out of Egypt, even into this promised land. 3 kinds of choices. We notice immediately that before Joshua called the people to make a choice, between, among those 3 options, Joshua revealed for them in verses 3 to 13 what God had done for their forefathers. Joshua actually was very considerate. Before you make this important choice, let me rehearse the history of your ancestors for you to help you make the important decision. Basically, Joshua was rehearsing the history, beginning with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He went on to remind them that God has sent Moses and Aaron to deliver his people from Egypt. And lastly, he recalled the events associated with the people of Israel arriving in the promised land and enabling them to occupy the territory so they could live there. So basically, Joshua rehearsed 3 things: Exodus, ancient, forefather stories, and the conquering of this promised land. 3 things. Fortunately, perhaps because of, the rehearsal of this bygone history, the generation gap that Joshua was so concerned did not play the trick. The communication was a success because the people declared, we also will serve the Lord because he is our God. Joshua was afraid that because of this lack of first-hand information, that people will choose, poorly. So after the rehearsal of the bygone history, the people declare that they will choose the same God that Joshua has chosen. Brothers and sisters, today we still have been challenged to make a wise choice when it comes to our most critical relationship. We have to admit that we have a tougher time making, that kind of choice than the people of Israel in Joshua's time. Why do I say so? Because we have more options to choose from. The situation is unlike, several thousand years ago. Many of us face a problem with choices in general. I mean, with so many options before us. So even if the best choice is right in front of our eyes, still we hesitate to make choice. Our indecision often becomes our decision. And not to decide leaves us aimless, constantly wavering between the options, but never being able to nail down our choice. Indecision very often becomes our choice. But thankfully, what the people of Israel knew well, we know even better today. Today, we have an advantage that the people of Israel in Joshua's time did not have. What is that? We have been given in the New Testament the rest of the story about God's way with us to help with that critical decision. People in Joshua's time did not have the New Testament. They did not know, following them, what will God be doing after their generation. They did not know. But we know. We have the entire Old Testament. And better than that, we have even the New Testament. We have the story of Jesus to help us know what is the way that God is choosing to deal with us. The New Testament tells the story of Jesus, who made choosing the Lord more appealing and even easier than choosing other options, including choosing not to choose. Jesus died on the cross, and that behavior hurled in the truth that before we choose anything, God chose us first. Before creation was on God's mind, we are on his mind. And God loved us before we even knew his name. More importantly and more meaningfully, on the cross, Jesus revealed that choosing to devote ourselves to God opens the door for nurturing healthy relationship, not only with God, but also with ourselves, with other people, and with the things that God has given us in this world. If our relationship with God is correct, our relationship with ourselves, with other people, with things in this world will not have any problem. Brothers and sisters, perhaps you have already made your own choice, and you smile quietly as you reflect on the value of your choice. Maybe you have set your heart on the Lord in a quiet place at the time that will always remain one of the critical turning points of your life. Some of you may, recall such moments. For example, you decide to be baptized. That is one of the turning points. But if you haven't made the choice, if some of you, in front of the camera or in person here in this room, if some of you haven't made the choice, if you are still wavering in the sea of indecision, tossed back and forth, you have to listen carefully. I pray that the time will come for you to make the choice. And for you to say, as Joshua has said, as for me, I will serve the Lord. And I will pray for God to give you whatever you need to come to that critical decision. When in doubt, remember Joshua chapter 24, actually the last chapter. Read that chapter before you make the most important decision, choice in your life. That is today's message. I will turn to the Taiwanese congregation